The building of a third temple is one of the biggest signs that the end times have begun. So, everyone wants to know, when will the third temple be built in Israel? Another related question is, will the two witnesses in Revelation chapter 11 play a role? Today we'll try to discover the surprising answer. Now, in previous videos, we've already looked at the role the red heifer plays in the building of the temple, and how quickly one could be built if a tabernacle tent could be set up in the interim. In fact, Rabbi Chaim Richman, head of the Temple Institute, confirmed in a lecture in 2018 that the Institute assumes the process to building the temple will likely be a gradual, step-by-step process that could include a tabernacle. But we really haven't looked at who will grant authority to build the temple, authority that can only come from God. Although Israel's parliament, the Knesset, and the ruling Muslim Waqf can grant political authorization, that's not God's authority. The Sanhedrin of 70 Orthodox Jewish leaders would like to think that they have that authority, but deep inside they know that it is not the same as God granting them that authority. King David, after all, wanted to build the first temple, but God denied him the right to do it and gave that privilege to his son Solomon. So the Sanhedrin, the Temple Institute, who have prepared all the implements for the temple, might want to build a temple, but they are waiting for one important ingredient: an okay from God. So who is it that could grant them that authority today? Either the Messiah, who most Jews believe should be the one to build the temple, or Elijah the prophet, who goes ahead of the Messiah. They are the only two with the biblical authority to pull the trigger on a construction project like that in the mind of religious Jews. And on every Passover, observant Jews set a place for Elijah the prophet at their table in hopes that he might join them. And at the end of the meal, they open their doors to see if he has arrived. Why do they expect Elijah? Especially because they are missing the one who actually is standing at that same door and knocking, the one who is their Passover lamb. So again we ask, why do they expect Elijah? Because the prophet Malachi prophesied that Elijah would come prior to the Messiah. Behold, I am going to send my messenger, and he will clear the way before me. And the Lord, whom you seek, will suddenly come to his temple, and the messenger of the covenant, in whom you delight. Note carefully that the messenger comes first, and only then does the Lord come suddenly to his temple. This is not lost upon the Jewish rabbis trying to understand what is required to build the temple. They have reasoned that this messenger must give the okay in order for the Messiah to come suddenly to the temple. In other words, the temple already has to be here if the Messiah is going to come to it suddenly. In the next chapter, Malachi identifies the messenger. Behold, I am going to send you Elijah the prophet before the coming of the great and terrible day of the Lord. He will restore the hearts of the fathers to their children, and the hearts of the children to the fathers, so that I will not come and smite the land with a curse. So the rabbis believe Elijah may be the one to give the okay to build the new temple. And since the Seder dinner not only commemorates the Jews' historical redemption from Egypt, but also calls to mind their future redemption when Elijah and the Messiah appear, well, they link Elijah's coming to Passover. So what are we Christians to think if and when a man claiming to be Elijah happens to appear, especially if he does miracles, like calling down fire from heaven like the historic Elijah, and then calling for the building of the temple? Would this possibly be the Elijah prophesied to come by Jesus himself, the one of whom Jesus said, and his disciples asked him, why then did the scribes say that Elijah must come first? And he answered and said, Elijah is coming and will restore all things. And he said this after the death of John the Baptist. How can Christians decide if this is the real Elijah. There are some simple answers, but let's ask the questions first. Why will this man ask to have a temple built? Will it be built as a temple to be a place of prayer for all nations? Jesus, after all, made the statement, "My house shall be called a house of prayer for all nations." Mark 11:17. So if he wants a temple only to be a place of prayer, well, that would be a positive sign that he might be the one. But what if he plans to have sacrifices done in the temple, specifically the red heifer sacrifice on the Mount of Olives or a Passover sacrifice? That is a major sign he would be a false prophet, since Jesus fulfilled those specific sacrifices as we discussed in our last video. If Elijah is one of the two witnesses, he will not authorize sacrifices which blaspheme the work of Jesus on the cross. Let's say that again. A sacrifice that blasphemes the work of the Messiah on the cross will not be a true prophet. He will be a false prophet of the synagogue of Satan. In the letter to the church of Smyrna, Jesus spoke of this exact thing and the blasphemy by which those who say they are Jews and are not, but are a synagogue of Satan. The second point is that the Old Testament only refers to Elijah, but Christians know there will be two witnesses who come on the scene and share the same 1260-day ministry. So we have two proofs that Christians like you and me can apply should a man claiming to be Elijah come to Israel. We would know him to be a fraud, possibly a demonic fraud, should he call for a red heifer sacrifice or a Passover sacrifice that were completely fulfilled by Jesus. We would also know he isn't one of the two witnesses if he starts his ministry without a second witness. And it is our opinion that someone claiming to be Elijah the prophet and or someone claiming to be the Jewish Messiah will come on the scene before the temple is built. The Jews want an okay from God to build it, and maybe a demonic witness will give them an okay from Satan to build it. And this fits perfectly with Jesus' statement in the Olivet Discourse, Matthew 24. Interestingly, the disciples were asking about the temple and its destruction, when Jesus answered this way, "See to it that no one misleads you, for many will come in my name, saying, 'I am the Christ,' or Messiah, and will mislead many." So the end time signs seem to begin with the arrival of false messiahs, not one, but several. In fact, Jesus said many would come in his name. We'll explain a little more who the many might be in a minute or so. Jesus also said false prophets would accompany the false messiahs. For false Christs and false prophets will arise and show great signs and wonders, so as to mislead, if possible, even the elect. This is such a great deception, Jesus felt the need to emphasize it. "Behold, I have told you in advance." So if they say to you, "Behold, he is in the wilderness, do not go out," or "Behold, he is in the inner rooms," do not believe them. So what are these inner rooms? Might they be the inner rooms of the temple? Well, I think so. Jesus might have likely been referring to the Holy of Holies and the Holy Place, the two inner rooms of the temple. Remember, he said you would see the abomination of desolation standing in the holy place, which is one of the two inner rooms. Now, Jesus says the deceptions of these false prophets and messiahs are so carefully planned and so skillfully carried out that even God's chosen ones would be deceived if that were possible. And the only reason it isn't possible is that Jesus told us he doesn't come that way. For just as lightning comes from the east and flashes even to the west, so will the coming of the Son of Man be. Matthew 24:27. Anyone appearing in the temple claiming to be the Messiah who doesn't come on the clouds in great glory that every eye sees is a false Messiah. Pure and simple, no matter how slick his presentation or how convincing his signs and wonders. But let's back up a bit to the building of the temple, not its desecration just yet. The Jews are expecting Elijah on Passover. So might a false Elijah come on Passover? Imagine 2,000 years of the Jews waiting for Elijah, every year pouring a cup of wine for him and opening the door on Passover. And then a man appears claiming to be Elijah, doing demonically empowered signs and wonders, perhaps even calling down fire from heaven. Can you imagine how overwhelmingly deceptive this would be for the Jews? And as we said, many Christians will easily be deceived by him as well, because Christians know that Elijah is to come, and signs and wonders are awfully hard to discount. People often ask, how is it that Jews will be deceived into worshiping anyone except a Jewish Messiah who fulfills all the requirements found in Scripture? Well, here is one way. If their very Jewish Elijah claims that someone is the Messiah, even if they aren't Jewish, many will go along with it because that's what their Elijah said. Even though we might know he's a false Elijah, he would be a Pied Piper. And this is exactly what Jesus prophesied to the Jewish leaders. I have come in my Father's name, and you do not receive me. If another comes in his own name, you will receive him. Jesus came fulfilling all the requirements of Messiah. He came in the name of Yehovah. But someone in the future will come in a different name, in his own name. He will claim to be a God, and that is the one some of the Jews will accept. Now, we may know why, possibly because a miracle-working Elijah says so. This deception may also work on Christians taken in by a false Elijah. So that is why it is important to be able to discern whether or not he is the real deal. And the real Elijah will not call for sacrifices already fulfilled by Jesus. Yet that may be one of the very first things the false Elijah undertakes, a Passover sacrifice. We know from 1 Kings that when the real Elijah took on the prophets of Baal, a holy fire consumed the sacrifice. Then the fire of the Lord fell and consumed the burnt offering and the wood and the stones and the dust and licked up the water that was in the trench. Will a false Elijah call down fire on Passover? On the sacrifice? If so, it would be a demonic fire from the sky. In the Torah, Aaron's 2 sons brought incense before the Lord, termed strange fire, and they were consumed immediately. But here it may take a few years before God consumes this Elijah. But a miracle like that certainly would convince almost everyone that this is Elijah. That also might include Muslims who believe Elijah is expected to come back along with the mysterious figure known as the Qadir during the Last Judgment or Day of the Lord. So a miracle-working Elijah would catch their attention as well and possibly convince many. As we said, it's hard to discount a real miracle, even a demonic one. People ask how Elijah might accomplish what no one else has, permission to have sacrifices performed on the Temple Mount. Perhaps this is how. Maybe enough Muslims would believe that this is the true Elijah too, that they go along with his plan. Which this ministry believes might be the sacrifice of a Passover lamb later on the Temple Mount, within a tent or tabernacle, which could easily be set up in a matter of days. And we also must ask, is this how the one world religion might begin? Jews, Muslims, and Christians all revere Elijah and are all looking for his return. Might this be a common bond that links the three faiths? Maybe. Of course, Jesus told us that the elect won't be deceived, but I can see how almost everybody else could be. From what we've said so far, you might surmise that if he arrives, a false Elijah might be the false prophet, the second beast of Revelation. He sure shares a lot of the same qualities. He's an Israeli. He might call down fire from heaven. Yet, what about Isa, the Muslim Jesus? We've suggested him as a candidate as well in another video. I think there will be many false messiahs and prophets, possibly a Messiah ben Joseph and a Messiah ben David, both of whom the Jews are expecting. It's also likely both the Sunni Muslims and Shia Muslims will each have a Messiah of their own, a Mahdi or 12th Imam. And then there might be the Muslim Jesus claiming to be Jesus himself. And maybe there will be some I haven't considered and some you haven't considered. I think we should be cautious in trying to sort out who these characters are too soon. The man who sits in the temple of God is the Antichrist. Personally, I'm glad God gave us such a definitive sign, because I think it will be very confusing to sort out who is who without a sign like that. And we also know that at some point the Jewish sacrificial system begins again. Those two things are things that we can really count on. When might this sacrifice take place in the scheme of Daniel's 70th week? Well, Daniel 8 may hold the answer. Then I heard a holy one speaking, and another holy one said to the one who spoke, "For how long is the vision concerning the regular burnt offering, the transgression that makes desolate, and the giving over of the sanctuary and host to be trampled underfoot?" And he said to me, "For 2,300 evenings and mornings. Then the sanctuary will be restored to its rightful state." We discussed this confusing and controversial passage in our series on Daniel. It's our understanding that the 2,300 evenings and mornings refer to 2,300 consecutive days, consecutive evening and morning sacrifice times in the temple, in what is known as the regular sacrifice. So to us, 2,300 evenings and mornings are 2,300 days. And that this time period marks three things: the starting of the regular burnt offering, the abomination of desolation, which then takes away the sacrifice, and the period that the sanctuary is trampled by the Gentiles, referred to in Revelation 11 as 42 months. So now we have a couple figures. Let's do a little math. Let's assume the 42 months of Revelation 11 is about 1,260 days. That means prior to the trampling there were 1,040 days, 2,300 minus 1,260. This 1,040 days would be the length of time that the regular burnt offering was taking place prior to being ended by the Antichrist at the midpoint of the 70th week. Doing a little more math, we can see that 1,040 is less than 3.5 years. That is the first half of Daniel's week. So the sacrifices don't start right at the beginning. They start approximately 220 days from the beginning. So if this theory is correct, the regular daily sacrifice would begin about 220 days after the start of the 70th week of Daniel. And that is pretty incredible information if we're right. Now, what day might that be? Our ministry's position is that it is likely that Daniel's 70th week begins on a Rosh Hashanah, or what is otherwise called Yom Teruah in the Bible. The Hebraic New Year. All Jewish secular years begin on this date, except the Jubilee year. Now, in a Jewish leap year, with an extra month added, which happens to occur about 50% of the time, This 220th day would then take place on either Nisan 14, 15, or 16. Now, Nisan 14 happens to be Passover itself, and the 15th and 16th are the days after Passover. How incredible is that? We've suspected a Passover sacrifice will start the sacrificial system. So the 220th day falling on a Passover, or one of the days after it, can be coincidence, but boy, the odds say it isn't. Let me say that again, because I think it's a very significant finding. The 2300 evenings and mornings of Daniel 8 has always been a puzzle. In fact, in the Septuagint, a different number of days is listed. However, if this theory we just presented is correct, it makes perfect sense that the sacrificial system will begin again with a Passover sacrifice in the very first year of Daniel's 70th week. So in this scenario we're painting, what happens during the 1,040 days of regular evening and morning sacrifices? Well, initially, the sacrifices take place in a tent or tabernacle, but construction of a temple begins during that period. Chaim Richman, who we mentioned before, the head of the Temple Institute, has estimated it will only take 1 year to construct the temple based on the plans they have. So, 1,040 days, which is really 2.5 years, is plenty of time. Richman also indicated a very interesting thing about the Ark of the Covenant. When directly asked about it, he indicated that he knew where it was, that a select number of Jews know in every generation, that it's in a secret chamber beneath the former site of the temple, and that when the time is right, the Jews will retrieve it. Belief in a hidden ark took root in Jewish literature. According to 2 Maccabees 2, 4-8, Jeremiah managed to conceal it. However, Maccabees, which is not part of the canon, was written over 400 years after Jeremiah's time. So there are some questions there. We presented a theory on where it might be hidden in this previous video. The Talmud, however, suggests King Josiah hid the ark, just as Richman claimed. Naturally, Richman favors the Talmud. But wherever it is our theory that it will surface, or a counterfeit ark will surface, during this 1,040-day period and be placed in the Holy of Holies. Then, on the third Passover, after sacrifices started, 3.5 years into the 70th week, the Antichrist will enter the Holy of Holies, accept the Passover sacrifice as an offering for himself, and sit upon the mercy seat of the ark, real or perhaps a counterfeit. And when he doesn't die, as what would have happened in the Old Testament, he'll declare himself to be a god, and that's the reason he doesn't die. This will be the abomination of desolation, in our opinion. This is an abomination to all major religions, not just to Christians. Believers of all faiths will reject this man claiming to be God himself. And the Antichrist has a very simple solution. His plan is to kill all those who reject him, leaving only his own followers. That is the Great Tribulation. So when people said Jews would never accept someone who isn't Jewish as a Messiah, some won't. They're the ones the Antichrist plans to kill. And it is our opinion that if there is a false Elijah, he will support the Antichrist as God and will say he, that is Elijah, is fulfilling Malachi 3:1. And it is then that the 42 months of trampling of the temple begins. And it is also at that moment that the heroes come on the scene. The 1260-day ministry of the two witnesses begin at that same moment. Measure the temple of God and the altar and those who worship in it. Leave out the court which is outside the temple. Do not measure it, for it has been given to the Gentiles, and they will tread underfoot the holy city for 42 months. And I will grant authority to my two witnesses, and they will prophesy for 1260 days, clothed in sackcloth. The 1260 days of the ministry of the two witnesses is almost exactly the same length of time as the 42 months that the Gentiles trample the holy city. So the two witnesses minister for the same time that the holy city is trampled. Now, the use of this term, holy city, is interesting. Elsewhere in Revelation, Jerusalem is always called the great city when it is prior to the return of Jesus. It's referred to as great city 8 times. It's referred to as the holy city 3 other times. But that is always after the New Jerusalem descends. Every time except this one time. So why is it called the holy city here? Possibly because it refers to those that will one day inhabit the New Jerusalem. Christians, of course, but also the Jewish remnant that Jesus will one day save, even though at this point that remnant does still not believe in him. These groups are being trampled. And that is the mission of the witnesses. They are witnessing to this remnant, so when the time comes, they can be saved. They are testifying against the abomination that is taking place in the temple and the horror of it to all who believe. Judah has dealt treacherously, and an abomination has been committed in Israel and in Jerusalem, for Judah has profaned the sanctuary of the Lord, which he loves, and has married the daughter of a foreign god. As for the man who does this, may the Lord cut him off from the tents of Jacob. Who are these two witnesses? In this previous video, the Two Witnesses documentary, we've discussed how one of them is likely the true Elijah. So if we are correct about all this, can you imagine the battle that will likely take place between the false Elijah and the true one? The anti-Elijah, so to speak, and the true Elijah. Wow, that will be something to see. Sort of like the encounter between Elijah and the prophets of Baal, I bet. In this video, we've presented some biblical facts, and we've presented scriptures to back them up. We've also presented some speculation that there will be an anti-Elijah, and we're not the only biblical ministry believing that that's possible. And we've presented it for the reason so that Christians will be watchful. So in case a character like this arises, and we know some false prophets will, they can identify the counterfeit from the real thing. Now, earlier in this video, we alluded to the link between the coming of Elijah and the Passover, and the abomination of desolation in the Passover. But did you know there's a possible link between Passover and the second coming as well? We learn about that in something we have termed the Passover Prophecy, spoken by our Lord Jesus himself. If you want to keep watching, well, click right here. And if you want to view all the videos in this playlist series, you can click right here and catch up on videos you may have missed. And don't forget to subscribe and ring the bell notification to be informed the minute new videos like this one are released. Till then, this is Nelson, and I'll see you there.